Married for 35 years to a powerful CEO, Martha Campbell's life seemed perfect from the outside. But when a devastating medical diagnosis coincides with her husband's betrayal with a teenage model, she finds herself thrown out of her own home with nothing but 3 suitcases and a broken heart. What Richard Campbell didn't know was that his perfect world was built on a secret that had been waiting 35 years to come to light. Sometimes, karma takes its time, but when it strikes hard. Witness a story of betrayal, justice, and the unstoppable power of a woman who refuses to be erased. It was a typical Sunday afternoon in Riverdale, Connecticut, and Martha Campbell's kitchen was filled with the familiar sounds of family life. At 55, she moved gracefully between the counter and stove, preparing the roast beef her grandchildren always begged for. Through the window, she could see her 3 grandkids playing in the backyard of the mansion she'd called home for 30 years. "Grandma, when's dinner ready?" 7-year-old Emma called out, her pigtails bouncing as she peeked through the door. "Just another 30 minutes, sweetheart," Martha replied, smiling despite the strange flutter in her chest that had been bothering her lately. Her husband Richard, CEO of Campbell Technologies, sat in the living room, his attention fixed on his phone. At 60, he still had the sharp looks that had attracted her when they first met, though his dark hair was now streaked with gray. Lately, he'd been more distant, constantly absorbed in what he called a game-changing project at work. As Martha reached for the oven door, that flutter in her chest suddenly became a sharp pain. She grabbed the counter, trying to steady herself. The room spun slightly, and she felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. "Mom, are you okay?" Her oldest son Michael was at her side instantly, his hand on her shoulder. "I'm fine, just a little dizzy," Martha tried to smile, but Michael wasn't buying it. "Dad," Michael called out, "something's wrong with Mom." Richard glanced up from his phone, irritation crossing his face. "What now?" The next few days were a blur of doctor's appointments and tests. Richard attended the first consultation but spent the entire time checking emails on his tablet. Martha couldn't help noticing a flash of something on his screen. An email from someone named Ashley, with a heart emoji in the subject line. She pushed the thought away, focusing on the doctor's increasingly serious expression. "Mrs. Campbell," Dr. Stevens said, his kind eyes concerned, "the tests show a severe cardiac condition. You're going to need surgery. And I'll be honest, it's high risk." Martha felt the room grow cold. "How soon?" "Within the next 2 weeks. We can't wait longer than that." Richard finally looked up from his tablet. 2 weeks? That's impossible. We have the tech conference in Vegas, and I need Martha there. Can't it wait a month? Dr. Stevens shook his head firmly. "Mr. Campbell, your wife's condition is serious. Without surgery, she could have a major cardiac event at any time." In the car ride home, Richard was unusually quiet. Martha noticed him typing furiously on his phone at red lights. She caught a glimpse of another email from Ashley, something about missing you at lunch today. That evening, while Richard was in his home office, Martha tried to check their shared tablet to see those emails again, but she found herself locked out. The sick feeling in her stomach had nothing to do with her heart condition. A week later, Martha was being prepped for surgery. Richard had claimed an emergency board meeting kept him from spending the night at the hospital. Their daughter Sarah had offered to stay instead. "Mom, why isn't Dad here?" Sarah asked, her voice small. Martha stared at the ceiling, fighting tears. "He's very busy with work, sweetheart. But you're having major surgery tomorrow." Richard finally showed up the next morning, just before they were about to wheel Martha into surgery. He looked irritated, checking his watch repeatedly. "I have an important meeting at 10, he said, not meeting her eyes. "I really can't believe you picked now to have this surgery. The timing couldn't be worse." Martha reached for his hand, but he had already pulled away to answer his phone. The last thing she saw before the anesthesia took hold was her husband of 35 years walking out of the room, phone pressed to his ear, a faint smile on his face that she'd never seen him direct at her. She didn't know it then, but that smile was the beginning of the end of her life as she knew it. Everything was about to change, and not in the way anyone could have predicted. Martha woke up alone in the recovery room. The steady beeping of monitors filled the silence, and her chest ached from the surgery. Sarah had left a note saying she'd be back after dropping the kids at school. No message from Richard. She closed her eyes and said a quiet prayer, something she'd been doing more frequently lately. The sound of footsteps made her look up, hoping to see her husband, but instead it was Linda, Richard's assistant of 15 years. "Mrs. Campbell." Linda's voice trembled. Her eyes were red from crying. "I'm sorry to come so early, but I couldn't wait anymore. There's something you need to know." Martha's heart monitor beeped faster. "Linda? What's wrong?" "I've worked for your husband for 15 years. Linda twisted her hands together. "You've always been kind to me. When my mother was sick, you brought meals to my house. I can't stay quiet anymore." Martha tried to sit up, wincing at the pain. "What's happening?" "It's about Mr. Campbell and Ashley Madison." Linda pulled out her phone. "She's not just another employee. She's only 18, fresh out of high school. She started as an intern at the company 3 months ago." The monitor's beeping increased. "What are you saying?" "They've been seeing each other. At first I thought it was just mentoring, but..." Linda's hands shook as she showed Martha her phone. "These are from the company party last week, while you were in pre-op." Martha stared at the screen. The photos showed Richard with a young woman at what was clearly a corporate event. She was beautiful, barely older than Martha's youngest daughter. In one photo, Richard's hand rested on her waist. In another, they were dancing close, his face lit up with that same smile Martha had seen when he left her before surgery. "There's more," Linda said softly. "Yesterday, while you were in surgery, they were together at your house. She's been posting everything on Instagram." Martha's fingers felt numb as Linda scrolled through more photos. Ashley Madison, lounging by her pool, drinking from her favorite coffee mug, sitting in her kitchen. Each image felt like another stab to her healing chest. "Why?" Martha whispered. "She's been bragging to everyone that she's going to be the next Mrs. Campbell." Linda's voice cracked. "She says you're old news, and Richard's promised her everything once you're out of the picture." Martha closed her eyes, remembering all the signs, the late meetings, the locked tablet, the missed hospital visits, the irritation whenever she needed him. "Mrs. Campbell, there's one more thing." Linda hesitated. "The tech conference in Vegas?" It wasn't a conference. Richard took her to meet his business partners, introducing her as his girlfriend. He's been planning this for months. A nurse came in to check Martha's vitals, frowning at the elevated numbers on the monitor. "Mrs. Campbell, you need to stay calm. Your heart needs rest." But how could she rest? Her entire world was crumbling around her, and she was trapped in a hospital bed, too weak to even cry properly. Later that afternoon, Richard finally appeared. He didn't bring flowers or a card, just his ever-present phone. "The board meeting went well," he said, not looking at her. "We're expanding the tech division. I'll need to travel more." Martha watched him, this stranger who wore her husband's face. "With Ashley Madison?" Richard's head snapped up. For a moment, shock crossed his features, quickly replaced by cold anger. "Who told you?" "Does it matter? Were you ever going to tell me yourself?" "You're being dramatic." He stood up, straightening his tie. "I was going to wait until you recovered, but since you want to discuss this now, yes, I've met someone else, someone young, vibrant, who understands my vision for the future. I gave you 35 years of my life," Martha's voice shook, "and now I'm giving you an easy way out." He walked to the door. "The lawyers will contact you once you're stronger. Try not to make this difficult, Martha. It's better for everyone if you just accept it." He left without looking back. Martha lay there, staring at the ceiling, her surgically repaired heart breaking in a way no doctor could fix. A week after her surgery, Martha stood at her front door, key in hand, only to find the locks had been changed. Her hands trembled as she rang the doorbell to her own home. After 35 years, she needed permission to enter her house. Ashley opened the door. "Oh, it's you," she smirked, twirling a set of keys. "Richard said you might show up." "This is my house," Martha said, her surgical scar aching from the tension. "Not anymore." Ashley stepped aside. "Richard's in his office. He's expecting you." Walking through her own home felt surreal. Family photos had been removed from the walls. Her favorite throw blanket was gone from the couch. In the kitchen, her morning coffee mug had been replaced by a pink one with Ashley's name. Richard sat behind his desk looking irritated. "You're early. The family dinner isn't for another hour." "Family dinner?" "I've called everyone to discuss the situation." He shuffled some papers. "The kids should know why their mother won't be living here anymore." Martha steadied herself against the doorframe. "You're telling the children over dinner?" "Better to get it all done at once." He finally looked up. "Your things are packed. My lawyer advised having you out before the divorce papers are filed." "My things are packed?" Martha's voice rose. "This is my home." "Actually," Richard smiled coldly, "the house is owned by Campbell Technologies. Corporate property. You'll find that most of our assets are in the company's name." The doorbell rang again. Their children arrived one by one. Michael, Sarah, and David, all looking confused. Ashley played hostess, serving drinks like she'd lived there for years. "Dad, what's going on?" Michael asked, noticing the missing photos. "Mom, why are there suitcases in the hall?" Richard stood, commanding attention. "I've called this dinner to announce some changes. Your mother and I are divorcing. I've met someone who better suits my current lifestyle." "Someone?" Sarah looked at Ashley, who was perched on the arm of Richard's chair. "She's barely older than me." "Age is irrelevant," Richard waved his hand. "What matters is that your mother will be moving out tonight. The house belongs to the company." "This is Mom's house," David jumped up. "She made it a home while you were building your precious company." "Speaking of the company," Richard's voice hardened, "let me be clear. Anyone who sides with your mother risks their inheritance. All your trust funds, college savings, and future shares are tied to Campbell Technologies." The room fell silent. Martha watched her children's faces as they processed the threat. "You can't do this," Michael said weakly. "I can, and I am." Richard handed Martha an envelope. "Your temporary credit card is maxed out at $500. The divorce papers will come next week. Don't bother fighting it. You signed a prenup." "I never signed a prenup," Martha protested. "Check the company contracts you signed in '92. It was included in the paperwork." Richard smirked. "You really should read everything before signing." Ashley laughed, a high-pitched sound that echoed through the room. "Don't worry, I'll take good care of everything here." Martha looked at her children, seeing the conflict in their eyes. They had families, mortgages, children in private schools, all dependent on Richard's money. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'll go." "Mom, no," Sarah started crying. "Your father's right about one thing," Martha straightened her shoulders. "It's better to get it done quickly." She walked to the hall where 3 suitcases waited. 35 years of marriage packed into 3 bags. "By the way," Richard called after her, "the Mercedes was a company car. You'll need to call a cab." Martha stepped out into the gathering dark. Through the window, she could see Ashley already rearranging furniture in what had been her living room. 35 years of memories being erased by a teenager with a signature on her lips and triumph in her eyes. As Martha waited for her Uber, she heard Richard's final warning. "Remember, Martha, if you try to fight this, I'll make sure everyone knows how you lost your mind after the surgery. Who would believe you over me?" The door closed with a final click, leaving Martha alone on the sidewalk, 3 suitcases at her feet, and a future as empty as the darkening street before her. Martha sat at her sister Susan's kitchen table, staring at her phone. Another Instagram notification popped up. Ashley posing in Martha's garden, announcing renovations to modernize this outdated space. The post had hundreds of likes, including several from company employees. "Stop torturing yourself," Susan said, taking the phone away. "You need to focus on healing." It had been 3 weeks since the night Richard threw her out. The surgical incision was healing, but everything else was falling apart. Her credit cards were declined everywhere. Her bank accounts were empty. Even her medical insurance had been canceled. "The church group asked about you again," Susan mentioned, pouring coffee. "Pastor Mike says you're welcome anytime." "I can't face people right now." Martha's voice was barely a whisper. "Everyone's talking about us. Because Richard's flaunting that teenager all over town." Susan slammed the coffee pot down. "Did you see the newspaper? He took her to the Children's Hospital fundraiser, your charity event." Martha had seen it. Ashley wearing a dress Martha had left behind, standing where Martha had stood for decades, announcing a donation in the new Mrs. Campbell's name. The doorbell rang. It was Michael, looking uncomfortable. "Mom, I'm sorry, but I can't stay long." He shifted on his feet. "Dad's watching our spending. He knows if we visit you." "It's okay, sweetie." Martha tried to smile. "How are the kids?" "They miss you. Emma keeps asking why she can't sleep over at Grandma's house anymore." He hesitated. "Dad's lawyer sent some papers. They're saying you are an employee, not a partner. Everything you signed, they're using it against you." After Michael left, Martha went through her old photos on her phone, but they were gone. Her cloud storage connected to the company account had been wiped clean. That afternoon, she made the mistake of driving past her old house. The gardens were being torn up, her rose bushes tossed in a dumpster. Ashley stood supervising, shopping bags at her feet. Back at Susan's, Martha finally broke down. "I have nothing left. No home, no money, no photos, not even my children can visit freely." "That's not true." Susan hugged her. "You have me, and you have something they can't take, the truth." But the truth felt worthless when Martha saw the society page the next day. Richard and Ashley at the Tech Industry Awards, her former friends smiling beside them. The caption read, "Campbell Technologies CEO and his fiancée celebrate record profits." Depression hit hard. Martha spent days in bed, the weight of loss crushing her. Her chest pains returned, forcing another hospital visit, this time to the public ward since she had no insurance. "Your heart is struggling," the doctor said. "Stress is making everything worse." That night, searching for extra blankets in Susan's guest room closet, Martha found boxes of her old things. She sat on the floor, surrounded by fragments of her past life. "I brought them when you moved to the mansion," Susan explained, finding her there. "You said you didn't need old memories anymore." Martha opened a box marked MIT days. Under dusty folders and certificates, something caught her eye. "I forgot about these," she whispered, pulling out old notebooks and floppy disks. "Your programming stuff?" Susan sat beside her. "From when you were teaching?" Martha nodded slowly, memories stirring. Before the mansion, before Richard's success, before she became just the CEO's wife, she had been someone else, someone who wrote code, who solved problems, who had dreams of her own. "Remember when you helped Richard start his first program?" Susan asked. "You used to work all night on that old computer." Martha stared at the disks in her hands. Somewhere in these relics of her past life was a very different story than the one Richard was telling the world. A story about who really wrote the code that started Campbell Technologies. For the first time since the night she was thrown out, Martha felt something other than despair. It was tiny, just a spark, but it was there. It felt like hope. Martha and Susan spent the entire night going through the old boxes. Folders of printouts, teaching notes, and dozens of floppy disks covered the guest room floor. "Look at this." Martha held up a notebook dated 1988. "These are my original algorithms, the ones I developed for my programming class." Susan squinted at the handwritten code. "Is this the same program Richard used?" "Not just used." Martha flipped through the pages. "This is the foundation of Campbell Technologies' entire system. I wrote this code while teaching at the community college." She found her old lesson plans, each one meticulously documented. "I remember now, I was teaching basic programming to adult students. Richard attended my night class." "That's where you met him." Susan nodded. "He was trying to start his tech company. He wasn't trying, he was failing." Martha pulled out more papers. "His original code didn't work. I helped him fix it, then gave him my teaching examples to study." Her hands trembled as she opened another folder. Inside were the original contracts from Campbell Technologies' early days. She scanned the documents, her eyes widening. "Susan, look at these dates." She spread the papers on the floor. "I signed these as a co-developer before we were married. Richard later said they were voided by our marriage license." "Can that be legal?" "I need to talk to a lawyer." Martha reached for her phone, then stopped. "But not just any lawyer. I need someone who understands tech patents." Susan smiled. "What about Roger Thompson? He was in your MIT class." "Roger?" Martha hadn't thought about him in years. "He specializes in intellectual property law now. But how can I afford a lawyer?" "Use my credit card," Susan insisted. "This is worth fighting for." The next morning, Martha sat in Roger Thompson's office in downtown Hartford. He looked different from their college days, but his sharp mind hadn't changed. "Martha Campbell," he smiled. "It's been decades." She placed her old notebooks on his desk. "I need your help, Roger, and I need absolute confidentiality." For 2 hours, she explained everything. The code, the contracts, Richard's lies, the divorce. Roger took detailed notes, occasionally nodding. "Show me the original algorithms," he said finally. Martha opened her notebooks. Roger studied the code, his expression growing serious. "This is remarkable," he said. "Do you realize what you've documented here? This isn't just similar to Campbell Technologies' core program, it's identical. The base code hasn't changed in 30 years. Can we prove it's mine? These notebooks are dated and documented. Your teaching materials show you using this code before Richard even started his company." Roger leaned forward. "But Martha, this is bigger than divorce proceedings. This is about intellectual property theft." "What do you mean?" "Campbell Technologies is worth millions because of this code. If you can prove you wrote it and that Richard essentially stole it." He paused. "You wouldn't just get a settlement, you could own the company." Martha felt dizzy. "Own the company?" "But we need to be strategic," Roger warned. "Richard has resources, lawyers. If he suspects anything, he'll bury these documents in legal challenges." "What should we do?" "First, we digitize everything. I have experts who can verify the age of the code, the paper, the ink, everything." He started writing a list. "Then we quietly contact your former students. We need witnesses who remember you teaching this material." "Some of them work in tech now," Martha remembered. "They might recognize the code." "Perfect," Roger smiled. "Martha, this is going to take time. Richard will fight dirty. Are you ready for that?" She thought of Richard's smirk, of Ashley in her house, of her children being manipulated with money, of 35 years being erased. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm ready." "Then let's get to work." Roger reached for his phone. "And Martha, don't tell anyone about this, not even your kids. The element of surprise is our biggest advantage." As she left Roger's office, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced since the night Richard threw her out: power. For the first time, she wasn't just Richard Campbell's discarded wife. She was a woman with a plan. Martha stared at her reflection in the gym mirror, surprised by the changes she saw. 2 months of daily workouts had transformed her body and renewed her energy. The post-surgery fatigue was gone, replaced by determination. "You're making amazing progress," her trainer Jenny said. "Ready to increase the weights?" While Richard flaunted his new life all over social media, Martha worked in silence. Every morning started at the gym, followed by coding tutorials at the local library. She'd traded her old housewife routine for a warrior schedule. "The basic programming concepts haven't changed much," her online instructor explained during their video sessions. "You just need to learn the new tools." Between workouts and studying, Martha met secretly with Roger's team. They worked from Susan's basement, documenting everything. Former students came forward, remembering her classes. "Mrs. Campbell's code changed my life," James Chen, now a software developer, told Roger's assistant. "I recognized it the moment I started working with Campbell Technologies systems. It was like seeing an old friend." Other students confirmed her story. They remembered the examples, the homework assignments, the exact algorithms. Roger's experts dated the notebooks, verified the paper, and documented every detail. "Richard's getting nervous," Susan mentioned one morning. "I heard he's been asking around about your activities." "Let him wonder," Martha said, closing her laptop. She just finished another coding refresher course. "He thinks I'm hiding in shame." The news of Richard's engagement to Ashley hit the local papers. The article mentioned Martha only as his previous wife. Her friends from the country club stopped calling. Her charity board positions were given to Ashley. But Martha didn't care anymore. While Ashley played society wife, Martha was rebuilding herself. Her mind was sharper, her body stronger, her purpose clear. "We found something interesting," Roger said during one of their meetings. "Richard's been selling company assets, moving money around. He's planning something big." "The company's stock dropped yesterday," Martha noted. She'd been tracking Campbell Technologies closely. First time in 5 years. "He's getting sloppy," Roger smiled. "Making mistakes, the board's starting to notice." Martha's children visited when they could, always careful to avoid Richard's attention. They noticed the changes in their mother but didn't ask questions. They just hugged her longer, their eyes full of worry and hope. "Mom seems different," Sarah whispered to Susan. "Stronger somehow." One evening, Martha found a familiar name in her coding forum. James Morrison, Campbell Technologies' biggest investor. He was known for his sharp eye for technical details. "Be careful," Roger warned when she told him. "Morrison's smart. He might connect the dots." But Martha had learned patience. She watched silently as Morrison posted questions about the company's original coding architecture. He was digging, though Richard probably didn't know it yet. "Your cardiac checkup was perfect," her new doctor announced. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." Martha caught her reflection in a store window downtown. The scared woman who'd been thrown out of her house was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone stronger. Her hair was styled differently, her posture confident, her eyes sharp. Richard wouldn't recognize her now, but he would soon. At home, Martha updated her progress log. Roger insisted on documenting everything, building their case methodically. The evidence was overwhelming. The original code, the witness statements, the paper trail. "We're almost ready," Roger said during their last meeting. "We just need the right moment." That moment came sooner than expected. Susan burst into Martha's room one morning, waving the local newspaper. "Richard's throwing a party at the mall's new wing opening," she exclaimed. "All the important investors will be there." Martha looked at her calendar. 3 months of preparation. 3 months of silence and hard work. 3 months of Richard thinking he'd won. "Perfect," she smiled. "Let's go shopping." The time for hiding was over. Martha Campbell was ready to step back into the light, and Richard would never see it coming. The Riverdale Mall's new wing opening was the social event of the season. Martha walked through the crowded space with James Morrison beside her, feeling the stares of former friends and acquaintances. "Ready?" James asked quietly. They'd planned this carefully. After discovering Martha's posts in the coding forum, James had reached out privately. He'd been investigating Richard's recent company decisions and found disturbing patterns. "Richard's getting careless," James had told her during their first meeting. "The board's concerned about his behavior, but we needed proof of misconduct. Then I found your old code." Now they walked together, strategically timing their arrival. Martha knew Richard and Ashley would be near the central fountain where the press was gathering. "Mrs. Campbell?" A young reporter stopped her. "From the Chronicle. Any comment about your ex-husband's engagement?" "No comment." James stepped in smoothly. "Miss Campbell and I are here as business associates." The whispers started immediately. James Morrison, Campbell Technologies' largest investor, walking with Richard's discarded wife. Phones appeared, taking pictures. Martha saw Ashley first, holding court near the fountain. The teenager wore an expensive dress and too much makeup, playing at being a corporate wife. Then Martha saw Richard. He was facing away, talking to board members, when Ashley's sudden silence made him turn. The champagne glass in his hand froze halfway to his mouth. Martha watched his face change as he processed what he was seeing. Gone was the broken woman he'd thrown out of her house. In her place stood someone he didn't recognize, walking confidently with his most important investor. "Richard," James called out, steering Martha toward the group. Quite an event. Richard's face had lost its color. "James, I didn't know you were coming." "I wouldn't miss it," James smiled. "Martha and I have been having fascinating discussions about the early days of Campbell Technologies." Ashley moved closer to Richard, suddenly unsure. "Darling, aren't you going to introduce me properly to Mr. Morrison?" But Richard was staring at Martha, trying to understand what he was seeing. His eyes moved from her transformed appearance to her easy familiarity with James. "How do you know my wife?" Richard's voice cracked slightly on the word wife. "Ex-wife," Ashley corrected quickly, but no one was listening to her. "Martha and I share many interests," James said, "particularly in software development. Did you know she was a programmer?" More people gathered around them, sensing drama. Board members watched with interest as Richard's face turned from pale to red. "That was a long time ago," Richard tried to laugh. "Just a hobby." "Actually," James continued pleasantly, "we've been reviewing some fascinating old code. The original Campbell Technologies architecture. Martha's insights have been illuminating. Richard's glass shook slightly. "Martha, what are you doing?" "Having a conversation about code," she replied calmly. "The code I wrote, Richard. The one you built your company on." Ashley looked confused. "Richard, what's she talking about?" But Richard was already pulling out his phone, probably trying to reach his lawyers. His hands trembled so badly he could barely type. "The board meeting on Tuesday will be interesting," James commented. "Lots to discuss about the company's founding." "You can't," Richard started, but stopped when he saw more board members gathering around them. Martha felt a buzz in her pocket, a text from Roger. Everything was ready. The documents were filed, the witnesses prepared, the evidence secured. "Wonderful party," she said, turning to leave. "Oh, and Ashley? Be careful with that prenup. Richard's very good at hiding things in paperwork." She walked away with James, feeling Richard's stare burning into her back. Behind them, she could hear Ashley's shrill voice demanding explanations. "Well done," James murmured. "The board's already talking. By Monday, Richard will be facing a full investigation." Martha smiled. Let Richard spend the weekend panicking, trying to cover his tracks. The real storm was coming, and for once, he was the one who wouldn't see it coming. "Mom?" Sarah's voice came from nearby. She'd been watching everything. "What's going on?" "Just business, sweetie." Martha hugged her daughter. "Everything's about to change." The Monday morning after the mall incident, Richard's world began to crumble. He arrived at Campbell Technologies headquarters to find the board already in session without him. "Emergency meeting," his secretary explained nervously. "Mr. Morrison called it." Inside the boardroom, James Morrison stood at the head of the table, presenting documents on the screen behind him. Roger Thompson sat beside him, surrounded by legal files. "Glad you could join us, Richard," James said. "We were just reviewing some interesting historical documents about the company's founding." Richard stopped short when he saw the familiar code on the screen. "Where did you get that?" "From your ex-wife's original teaching materials," Roger replied. "Dated and documented from 1988, before Campbell Technologies existed." The board members watched as Richard's face turned white. One of them, an older woman named Patricia Wells, spoke up. "Is it true, Richard? Did you steal the core architecture from Martha?" "This is ridiculous," Richard sputtered. "She was my wife. Everything we did was joint." "Except you claim sole credit," James interrupted, "and sole ownership. We have the original patents here, filed under only your name." Roger stood, distributing folders to each board member. "The evidence is clear. Mrs. Campbell's code forms the foundation of this company's success. She has witnesses, documentation, and proof of her work predating Campbell Technologies. She signed contracts." Richard slammed his fist on the table. "She gave up any claims." "About those contracts," Roger smiled, "we found some interesting irregularities, specifically documents that were altered after signing." The boardroom door opened again. Martha walked in, followed by 3 people Richard hadn't seen in years. "You remember my old students?" she asked quietly. "They're very successful in tech now. They immediately recognized my code when they started working here." "This is corporate espionage." Richard tried to stand, but his legs seemed weak. "I'll sue everyone in this room." "Actually," James cut in, "the SEC is very interested in your recent financial activities. Selling company assets, moving money offshore, all while knowing this revelation was coming." Richard's phone buzzed repeatedly. News was breaking online about potential fraud at Campbell Technologies. The stock was already dropping. "We don't need a scandal," Patricia Wells said firmly. "Richard, you should consider stepping down quietly." "Step down?" Richard laughed hysterically. "This is my company." "Is it?" Roger opened another folder. "According to these original documents, Martha owns 51% of the intellectual property that built this company. The board will need to vote on new leadership." Richard reached for his phone again, probably to call his lawyers, but his hands were shaking too badly to dial. The door burst open once more. Ashley stormed in, her face streaked with tears. "Richard, why is your personal trainer texting me about payment for private sessions?" The boardroom fell silent. James raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps we should discuss the company's moral clause as well?" Richard collapsed into a chair, his empire crumbling around him. Martha watched him silently, remembering the night he'd thrown her out of their home. "The vote is unanimous," Patricia announced after a quick poll. "Richard, you're suspended pending investigation. Security will escort you out." "You can't do this," he whispered, but no one was listening. As security led Richard away, Ashley close behind screaming about her prenup. Martha remained in the boardroom. James turned to her with a smile. "Ready for phase 2? Martha nodded. The hard part was just beginning. Taking back her company was one thing, running it was another. But she'd been preparing for this moment. "The programming world should know the truth," she said firmly. "About women in tech, about stolen credit, about everything." "They will," James promised. "But first, let's get you back into your office. The real one this time." Martha looked around the boardroom, remembering the scared woman she'd been just months ago. That woman was gone. In her place stood the true founder of Campbell Technologies, ready to reclaim her legacy. The truth had finally come out, and it had set her free. The legal battle that followed became the talk of the tech industry. Every major technology publication covered the story. Campbell Technologies' founder exposed the woman behind the code. Richard's response was swift but desperate. He called an emergency press conference from his lawyer's office. "These allegations are false," he declared, his tie loose and his face haggard. "Martha is trying to destroy what I built because she's bitter about our divorce." But evidence kept emerging. Roger's team released documents strategically, each one more damaging than the last. First came Martha's original teaching materials, then student testimonials, followed by technical analyses proving the code's origins. "The timestamps don't lie," a tech expert explained on CNBC. The basic architecture of Campbell Technologies' main product was written while Mrs. Birchstaff Campbell was teaching programming. Mr. Campbell was her student. Richard tried fighting back. He offered money to former students to change their stories. Some received threatening calls from his lawyers. But it backfired when one recorded the conversation and sent it to the SEC. "He offered me $2 million to lie," James Chen testified, "to say I never took Mrs. Campbell's class. But I kept all my old assignments. The code is right there, dated 1988. Martha watched it all from her temporary office at company headquarters. James Morrison had insisted she take an active role during the transition. "The employees need to see you," he explained. "Especially the women in tech roles. You're changing the narrative." Young female programmers started leaving post-it notes on her door. "Thank you for speaking up. You inspire us." Finally, the truth. Richard's world continued to unravel. The SEC investigation revealed irregular stock trades and hidden accounts. Board members discovered their signatures on documents they'd never seen. "He's been forging approvals for years," Patricia Wells announced during an emergency board meeting. "The fraud goes deeper than we thought." Ashley, meanwhile, had her own problems. Photos surfaced of her with Richard's personal trainer, Brad, at various hotels. The prenup she'd signed turned out to be heavily weighted in Richard's favor, something she discovered too late. "I was supposed to get half," she screamed at reporters outside her lawyer's office. "He promised me half of everything." Martha's children finally learned the whole story. They sat in her new office as she explained about the early days, the code, the stolen credit. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" Sarah asked, tears in her eyes. "I needed to be sure," Martha replied. "And I needed to be strong enough to fight." Michael, who worked in the company's sales division, brought more revelations. "Dad's been lying about sales figures. The new tech division is failing. He's been covering it up for months." The final blow came when Richard's personal emails were subpoenaed. They revealed conversations with Ashley dating back to when she was still in high school, months before she started as an intern. "This isn't just a civil case anymore," Roger informed Martha. "The FBI is interested in several aspects of Richard's conduct." Richard made one last desperate move. He tried to call an emergency shareholder meeting to vote Martha out. But when he arrived at headquarters, security stopped him at the door. "I'm sorry, sir," the guard said. "Your access has been permanently revoked." Through the lobby windows, Richard watched as Martha led a team meeting in the glass-walled conference room. She was explaining something at a whiteboard, employees nodding and taking notes. She looked completely at home. "She's ruining everything," he muttered to his lawyer. "We have to stop her." But his lawyer had already heard from the FBI. "Richard," he said quietly. "I think we need to discuss a plea deal." Martha didn't watch as Richard was escorted out for the last time. She was too busy reviewing code with her development team, planning the company's future. Mrs. Campbell, a young programmer, raised her hand. "Can you tell us more about how you developed the original algorithm?" Martha smiled. Finally, after 30 years, she could tell her story. And this time, everyone was listening. Richard sat alone in his rented apartment, surrounded by empty takeout containers and legal papers. The TV droned in the background, another news report about Campbell Technologies' historic leadership change. His phone buzzed. A text from Ashley. "We need to talk. Meet me at the Capitol Grill." He found her at the bar, but she wasn't alone. Brad, his former personal trainer, sat beside her. On the table lay a manila envelope. "What's this?" Richard asked, his voice hoarse. "Insurance," Ashley smiled coldly. "Brad's been recording our sessions, all of them, including the conversations about your offshore accounts." Richard sank into a chair. "You were recording me?" "Of course she was," Brad smirked. "Ashley's smarter than you think. She knew you'd try to dump her eventually." The bartender turned up the TV volume. A reporter stood outside Campbell Technologies headquarters. "Sources say the SEC investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic fraud." "Turn it off," Richard snapped. But no one listened. Ashley leaned forward. "Here's the deal. I want $10 million, cash. Or these recordings go to the FBI." "I don't have access to that kind of money anymore." Richard's hands shook as he reached for a water glass. "Everything's frozen." "That's not my problem." Ashley stood, gathering her designer bag. "You have 48 hours, or else. You can't do this to me." Richard grabbed her arm. "I gave you everything." "No," Ashley pulled away. "You gave me promises. Martha was right about you. You hide everything in the paperwork." She left with Brad, leaving Richard staring at his reflection in the bar mirror. His hair had gone completely gray in the past month. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The next morning, things got worse. His lawyer called with news about the FBI investigation. "They have emails, Richard, about Ashley from before she was 18. "Those were just conversations," Richard protested weakly. "They're calling it grooming, and with the financial fraud charges." His lawyer paused. "You need to consider a plea deal. Today." Richard drove to his old house, parking across the street. The gardens Martha had loved were being replanted. Through the windows, he could see moving boxes. The realtor sign said sold. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Ashley's threats. His lawyer's warnings. News alerts about the company's stock price soaring under Martha's leadership. He tried calling his children. No one answered. Even his country club membership had been revoked. Back at his apartment, Richard found more bad news. His credit cards were declined. The offshore accounts he'd hidden were frozen. Ashley's prenup, which he'd thought would protect him, was worthless now that she had evidence of his crimes. The final blow came that evening. His lawyer sent an urgent message. The FBI had received recordings from an anonymous source. They were coming to arrest him in the morning. In desperation, Richard drove to Campbell Technologies at midnight. His keycard was deactivated, but he knew the security guard's schedule. He made it to his old office, only to find it completely changed. Martha's touches were everywhere. On the desk sat a framed photo of her with the development team, all smiling. "You can't be in here." A security guard appeared at the door. "Sir, I'm calling the police." As they led him out in handcuffs, Richard caught a glimpse of tomorrow's press release on a desk. Campbell Technologies announces historic partnership under new leadership. The police station was cold. They took his belt, his tie, his dignity. "Richard Campbell," the booking officer read, "you're under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and other charges." He thought of Martha, who he'd thrown out months ago. She was probably in their old house now, planning the company's future. The company she'd actually created, while he'd spent decades taking credit. "I need to make a call," he said weakly. "Your lawyer's already been notified," the officer replied. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Campbell." In his holding cell, Richard finally understood. He'd lost everything. Not because of Martha's revenge, but because of his own actions. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment of greed had led to this. The empire he'd stolen had finally crumbled, burying him in its ruins. Martha stood at the podium in Campbell Technologies' main conference room, facing a packed audience of employees, press, and board members. The company's new logo gleamed behind her. CT, Innovation Through Integrity. Today marks a new chapter, she began. We're launching the Women in Tech Scholarship Program, providing full tuition and mentorship to 50 promising female programmers each year. James Morrison sat in the front row, smiling proudly. Over the past weeks, their professional partnership had grown into something more. Though they kept it private, there would be time for that later. The scholarships will be funded by redirecting the offshore accounts we recovered, Martha continued. Money that was hidden will now help build futures. Sarah and Michael sat with their children in the audience. Emma, Martha's granddaughter, clutched a toy laptop, her eyes fixed on her grandmother. Programming changed my life twice, Martha said. First when I discovered it at MIT, and again when it helped me reclaim my truth. Every woman deserves that opportunity. The announcement made national news. Tech giant rights historic wrong, read one headline. Female founder reclaims company and reshapes industry, declared another. Back in her office, Richard's old space completely transformed, Martha met with her development team. The walls now displayed framed code printouts from her teaching days. The original architecture was brilliant, a young programmer said, examining the old code. But we can make it better, may we? Martha smiled. That's why I hired you. Innovation doesn't belong to one person. It grows when shared. The company culture transformed rapidly. The toxic competition Richard had fostered gave way to collaboration. Women who'd been overlooked for promotion suddenly found their ideas welcomed. Sales are up 40% this quarter, Patricia Wells reported during a board meeting. Turns out ethical leadership is good for business. Martha's children thrived in the new environment. Michael's sales team set records. Sarah, who'd always loved computers but felt intimidated, joined the coding boot camp. I can't believe I was afraid to try, Sarah said, showing Martha her first program. Dad always said women weren't good at tech. The family moved back into the mansion, but Martha had it renovated. Richard's dark wood panels were replaced with bright, open spaces. The gardens bloomed again. One evening, James joined them for dinner. The grandchildren adored him, especially when he helped them with their coding homework. Uncle James, Emma called, look at my robot game. Martha watched them from the doorway, remembering lonely dinners while Richard worked late, or so she'd thought. Now her home buzzed with life and laughter. The final piece fell into place when Roger called with news about Richard's plea deal. He's accepting all charges, Roger reported. No trial. The evidence was too strong. And Ashley? Martha asked. Working at a mall boutique in Ohio, the recordings she tried to blackmail Richard with became evidence. She's lucky to avoid charges herself. Martha hung up and walked to her home office. On her desk sat the notebook where it all began, her original code, the foundation of everything. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. James stood there, looking nervous. I have a question, he said. Not about business. Martha felt her heart skip, not from illness this time, but from joy. Later that evening, the family gathered for dinner. Martha looked around the table, her children, grandchildren, James, Susan, and felt complete. Mom, Michael raised his glass, to your new beginning. Martha squeezed James's hand under the table. To all our new beginnings. Upstairs in her study, her old MIT notebook lay open, its pages filled with code that had changed her life twice. But the real triumph wasn't in the code or the company. It was in the truth finally set free. 1 year later, Martha stood in the auditorium of MIT, facing the first graduating class of Campbell Technologies scholars. 50 young women in caps and gowns ready to enter the tech world. When I taught my first programming class, she began, I had no idea my code would build a multi-million-dollar company. But more importantly, I never imagined it would create this, a chance to change other women's lives. In the front row, Emma sat between Sarah and James, wearing a future programmer t-shirt. At 12, she'd already completed 3 coding camps. The ceremony marked more than just graduation. Campbell Technologies had transformed under Martha's leadership. The stock price had doubled. Employee satisfaction reached record highs. The toxic culture Richard created was gone. Your careers start tomorrow, Martha told the graduates. You'll face challenges. People will doubt you. Remember this, your ideas matter. Your code matters. Your voice matters. After the ceremony, Martha checked her phone. A news alert showed Richard leaving prison for his first parole hearing. He'd aged decades in 1 year. The article mentioned his new job as a data entry clerk, the only work he could find with his record. "Mrs. Campbell?" A graduate approached. "I read about how you reclaimed your company. You inspired me to fight for my own patent case." These stories had become common. Women across the tech industry started speaking up, demanding credit for their work. Martha's case had opened a floodgate. Back at headquarters, the changes were visible everywhere. The development team was now 50% female. The board had achieved gender parity. Even the company's products had improved, reaching new markets. "The quarterly numbers are exceptional," Patricia Wells reported. "The new mobile platform your team developed is outperforming projections by 200%. Martha's office, once Richard's dark fortress, now hosted regular mentoring sessions. Young programmers gathered to learn, share ideas, and build the future. "Mom," Sarah entered with excitement. "My app passed beta testing. The review board approved it for release." Martha hugged her daughter. Sarah had discovered her own talent for programming, creating educational apps for children. Emma had already tested the first version. That evening, Martha and James hosted a family dinner at home. The walls, once covered with Richard's hunting trophies, now displayed family photos and the grandchildren's artwork. Through the windows, Martha's rose garden bloomed again. "I have news," Michael announced. "We're expanding the scholarship program internationally, 10 countries next year." The company's transformation had exceeded everyone's expectations. But for Martha, the greatest change was personal. She looked around the table at her family, whole and happy again. Susan raised her glass. "Remember when you crashed on my couch? Look at you now, sis." Martha smiled, remembering those dark days. "I had help from all of you." James squeezed her hand. Their wedding bands caught the light. They'd married 6 months ago, a quiet ceremony in the restored garden. After dinner, Martha found Emma in the home office, studying the framed code from 1988. "Grandma," Emma pointed to the algorithm. "This part's genius. Did you really write it during class?" "I did." Martha sat beside her granddaughter. "Want to learn how?" As they worked together, Martha thought about legacy. Not the company or the money, but the truth she'd reclaimed. Every line of code she wrote now carried her name. Every woman she helped carried that truth forward. Richard had tried to erase her. Instead, he'd sparked a revolution. The evening news played quietly in the background. Campbell Technologies announces expansion of Women's Coding Initiative. CEO Martha Campbell says this is just the beginning. Martha looked at Emma, already lost in the joy of coding, and knew it was true. This was just the beginning. For her granddaughter, for the scholarship recipients, for women in tech everywhere. The truth had not only set her free, it had given her wings to soar. And she was never coming down. If Martha's story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in her situation? Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about justice, second chances, and the triumph of truth. Remember, it's never too late to reclaim your power and rewrite your story. Sometimes life's greatest victories come after our darkest moments. Keep believing.